Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative questions of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Alex Clare-Young, and I am JPIT's Campaigns and Church Engagement Officer. I'm still pretty new in the role, so if you want to know more about me, do have a look at the blog. But for now, I'm going to introduce the more interesting people. Today's guest is Sam Wells. Welcome, Sam. Sam writes, speaks, preaches, and broadcasts on a range of pastoral, political, and theological issues. He has been the Vicar of St Martin-in-the-Fields in Trafalgar Square, London, since 2012, and is also visiting professor of Christian ethics at King's College London. Sam has served as a parish priest for 27 years, 10 of those in urban priority areas, and also spent 7 years in North Carolina, where he was the Dean of Duke University Chapel. Sam has published 47 books, and the most recent is Constructing an Incarnational Theology. Joining us today also from JPIT is Paul Morrison. Paul is our policy advisor with particular responsibilities for issues around the economy, including poverty and inequality. So before we get started speaking about today's texts, let's set a bit of context. As we record, many of the top headlines are about Donald Trump and particularly his first 100 days in office. He's quoted as saying, "We're just getting started," in his speech at a rally to mark the moment. Elsewhere, the UK launches Yemen airstrikes in first involvement since Trump's re-election. And in England, local election campaigns enter their final day after parties clash in a relatively heated TV debate. That vote will have taken place by the time this episode airs. So today we will be looking at the lectionary readings for Sunday, the 11th of May, which is the fourth Sunday of Easter. We're going to be looking at Acts 9, 36 to 43, where Peter meets Dorcas or Tabitha. We're going to be looking at Revelations chapter 7, 9 to 17, which describes a multitude from every nation praising God. And we're going to speak a bit about John 10, 22 to 30, where Jesus experiences a rejection. The 11th of May is also the beginning of Christian Aid Week. This year, Christian Aid Week focuses on the effects of the climate crisis on indigenous farming communities in Guatemala. So you may want to have a look at their resources as well as you're preparing to preach this Sunday. So, Sam, your work combines the pastoral and the theological with the political. Does that mean that for you, politics does have a natural place in the pulpit?
Well, thanks for that kind introduction. It's great to be with you, and blessings on all your work. I published a book called How to Preach about a year or 18 months ago, and I had a chapter in there about political preaching. And I set out 10 guidelines people might be interested in. I'm not going to go into them now, but about the do's and don'ts, really, of political preaching. And probably the most important one is don't be boring. So, to say I have some issues with the alignment of Donald Trump's philosophy of life with the kingdom of God or God's realm, is not interesting, actually. I think you could probably assume that 95% of preachers in this country would take that view, and probably a similar percentage, possibly slightly smaller, of their listeners. So you've got to choose your subjects. You can't become a one-trick pony. But the Bible is always political and always personal. And the skill is to draw the political out of the personal and to make the political personal. So it goes in both directions. The great African-American theologian from whom Martin Luther King got a great number of his ideas, spoke about how the Bible is written by people with their backs to the wall. And if you look through the if you actually work your way through the Bible, the large majority of it, leaving aside arguably 1 and 2 Samuel, for example, but pretty much all the rest of it is written by people with their backs to the wall. And they are struggling with, in the Old Testament, how on earth did we find ourselves in exile? And in the New Testament, if God is in control of history, what are we doing? Suffering persecution. So those are the kind of issues that the people writing the Bible are dealing with and taking for granted. So to say that the Bible has got nothing to do with politics is ridiculous, really.
Mm, thank you. Paul, you do a lot of work in JPIT on working with people with lived experience, and I wonder if some of that chimes with some of what Sam is saying here.
I think there's been many sort of great experiences as we tried to develop our work with lived experience, but one of the ones that sticks out is reading the parable of the Good Samaritan with a group of people with people who had experienced or were experiencing homelessness, and their backs were against the wall, to use that term. And it's a very different passage when you read it sat in the pavement. And I had never been somewhere where the instinct was to put yourself in the place of the person being beaten up, as opposed to put yourself in the place of the person who is giving out the help, which is where I had always put myself, and I think every preacher I had talked to had put themselves in that place. Mm-hmm. So that resonates a great deal, that having your back against the wall and where changes how we view the Bible. And if that's how it was written, then we have to put our minds in that to understand what's truly meant by the passages.
Yep, absolutely. And I think we can see in the passages that we're going to talk about today that there are quite a few people with their backs against the wall in different ways. Dorcas and those who are mourning at the beginning of this story for her, not to mention actually Jesus with his back against the wall in some ways in our reading from the Gospel. Sam, is there a particular passage out of these that you would pick to preach from, or is there a theme kind of going across them that you'd want to draw out?
Yeah, I'm not a theme across them person. I very much discourage the preachers from saying, let's look at all 3 readings. I think those in the Church of England who are familiar with the alternative service book from 1980 that was used for about 20 years will have got thoroughly tired of that thematic approach, because it just doesn't let the passages speak in all of their authenticity. So I usually think if you've got 15 minutes, shall we say, you haven't really got time to do justice to one passage, and it's kind of lazy, really, to try to do more than one. But anyway, that's just a hobby horse of mine. I'm a bit torn, I think, because I guess I have different kinds of sermons. One favorite kind of sermon is, this is only 9 verses, or how many verses is the Acts passage? It's 8 verses, I think, isn't it? This is only 8 verses, but actually it contains the whole gospel. Let's look at it closely. It looks like, and here's another healing, another raising from the dead in Acts. There's a bunch of them. It's a bit like someone in the Gospels. What's the big deal? And actually, if you look at it closely, as I'm sure we'll do in a moment, then you can draw out, and by the end of the sermon, you've basically said, gosh, what in the gospel isn't here? And it's very satisfying, and it can be very rewarding, both in terms of inspiring people to read the Bible with new eyes, but also a tremendous sense of the completeness of what the Holy Spirit's saying to us today. A different kind of sermon, and one that's much more for the gut, really, would be one that came out of the John passage, because the John passage more or less repeats a phrase, no one can snatch them out of my hand. I mean, I just think, for a person facing death, for a person who is, is anxious about a hostage in a foreign country, and they don't know how many more months they'll not be able to see their loved one, for a person who is caring for a multiply disabled child who isn't expected to live beyond 2 years, those words can just be, transformative. And in the end, we all read the Gospels and the Bible in the face of death. And it's a different kind of sermon that really, on a gut level, engages with how profoundly we face horror, whether that's physical horror, whether that's persecution, whether that's death, shame, any of these things. And those words that nothing can, that we cannot be snatched out of God's hands are. So I think I would be going in one of those two directions. There are things to be said about the Revelation passage, which I'm sure we'll come to, but to me, there's one that's kind of more for the head, which is the Acts passage, and one more for the heart and gut, which is the John passage.
Which would you go for, Paul, head or gut?
I think the "no one can snatch them out of my hand" is a phrase I had underlined, and I think for lots of the issues that we talk about, and lots of the sort of places where the church touches politics, that's an incredibly powerful statement. So again, when you're working with people lived experience of poverty, knowing that even though you may feel rejected, you may feel at the absolute bottom of the pile and no one cares about you, no one can snatch you out of the hand is an incredibly powerful thing to say. And
Yes.
I know that I would find it really difficult to preach from Revelation. I've always found it quite a difficult book to get my head around, and to not feel that I am doing no justice to the words. But at the end of the passage, there's that sort of great description about how you are being kept safe, about safe, never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst, which I think we tend to spiritualize a lot. But I think to people whose back's against the wall, and going back to that thing, I think it was probably, lots of the people who this was told to were slaves. They being told that means something real in the here and now. And sadly, for lots of people, hearing those words are important now, and in a literal way.
Absolutely. So let's go a little bit deeper into the passages, and we'll start with the Acts and John, the head and heart of the week, and then we'll just talk a little bit about Revelation. And I've been thinking a little bit about how I might try and link the Revelation passage into some of what Christian Aid are doing around Christian Aid Week. So I will see what you both think of that in a little bit. I could be entirely going in a strange direction there, but let's start with Acts. So Sam, you spoke about the way in which the Acts reading actually in some ways contains the whole of the gospel, and that means that this is going to sound like a very big question, but what for you is some of the good news in that reading?
Well, it's something I don't usually do a lot of when I'm preaching, but I think is helpful in understanding this passage, is to locate it within the book of Acts. You don't usually need to do a lot of that when you're preaching on the gospel, but people don't know the book of Acts quite as well. So this comes after a previous story about Aeneas, and rather like, Luke, assuming that Luke wrote both Acts and Luke's Gospel, it's a very Lucan thing to do, to match a story about a man with a story about a woman. You think about Luke 15, the Good Shepherd, and then the woman with the lost coin. That's quite a sort of Lucan motif. And so there's a balance there. And, there have been other balances earlier, an unfortunate one with Ananias and Sapphira, who both, again, involving Peter, fall down dead. And there's a sort of sense that was a bit of an overreach, and this is a kind of bit of redemption. But we also get, in a wider frame, beyond these two stories, we obviously get the story of Saul's conversion, and we get the story of Cornelius, which is, goes on for a chapter and a half. So the real story here is a story of belonging, and I think rhetorically, I think I would shape a sermon about this by saying, in a murder mystery, in an Agatha Christie, Hercule Poirot will spend the first 2/3 of the story looking for clues, and then when he's found a vital clue, he's found a vital clue, you just don't know why it's vital. And I think the vital clue in this passage is tucked away in a place where you could easily not see it. And it's the word saints, because it's there in verse 41, calling the saints and widows. Because I think what this story is about is about saying there is a place for everyone in God's realm. So we've got a sociologically interesting pair of observations in the first couple of verses. The first interesting observation is that she is a benefactor. And again, you think of that as a male role, but she's a benefactor, and she not only does things herself, but she pays for things to be done for other people. So she's a very influential woman. And why do we know that she's wealthy? It's because they laid her in a room upstairs. Poorer people didn't have an upstairs. So that's telling us that this is a house of substance, and this is a woman of substance. A leader of the Christian community who was a woman, and that's an interesting thing to say in something like 40 AD. Some people are struggling in 2025 AD with the notion of women in leadership, or women in senior positions in any walk of life, but certainly in the church. Well, here we are in 40 AD, and here she is. She's even got two names. So then we get other themes going on. Either the upstairs room is referred to twice, which is a form of emphasis. We get widows, and it's interesting here because if you remember, Stephen was among the deacons that were set aside to look after people such as the widows, so that Peter could do the real work. Well, interestingly here, Peter has made a journey and recognized that the widows are the real work. So he's involved with the widows. And so there's a sort of journey of humility that he's made about a different form of exclusion. We're already kind of moving through gender here. We've got the social position of widows who have lost their form of income and stability and security through losing their husbands. Whether widow is actually a more wide-ranging term than simply referring to their marital status is, I don't really know, but I imagine it might well be. And then you can see that this is we've got a wider range. We were talking just now, very interestingly, Paul was talking about who's the story really about, referring to the Good Samaritan story. Well, the people that have lost their clothing, they have been made naked by Dorcas's death, because she made and provided clothing for them. And then we've got all these different kinds of people. We've got Paul, who's the the persecutor of the faith. We've got Dorcas, obviously a woman, and we've got the widows who are excluded on the grounds of poverty. And obviously we've got those who are dead, but those are raised. And then finally, in case you missed it, but you probably wouldn't miss it again if you were reading the whole of this part of Acts, because I think he's mentioned 3 or 4 times, Simon the tanner. Why is that interesting? Well, because tanners had to do things with animal hides that made them unclean within the Jewish ritual purification system. So we've got 4 or 5 different forms of exclusion here. And in the course of the story, all of these people become part of God's realm. They all become saints, if you like. It's a sort of I always get centripetal and centripetal story in which all of these people are outsiders who become central to the action of God. And then interestingly, and obviously difficult for Catholics, Peter himself makes a journey of humility where he gets a much broader notion of his mission than simply communicating the word, and he realizes that providing for the widows is actually integral to the Christian mission, along with sharing the word the resurrection of Joshua. It was fashionable to make comments like Tabitha sounds a bit like Talitha cum in the Gospel, the synoptic story of the raising of Jairus's daughter. That's quite a sort of historical critical thing to say, and the tendency 50 years ago would be to say, oh, well, that shows there was only one story, and they got mixed up between whether Peter raised her or whether Jesus raised her, and whether she was a girl or a woman, or that was a very fashionable thing in the historical critical era, which mercifully is now largely over. But a better way to think of it is to take that line from John's Gospel: if anyone follows me, they will do even greater things than these. And this is basically saying you can tell these people are apostles because they do what Jesus did. And so we've got this wonderful story of inclusion. There's a place for everybody, and so everyone has a vital place to play in the story. There's nobody you could take out of the story and still have all the story you need. All of these people are crucial to the story. And so the early church becomes a community of a polyglot range of different kinds of people, all of whom have experienced exclusion, extreme exclusion, including death, but obviously social, economic, ritual, etc., exclusion, gender, and so on. And Peter in the middle of it, who himself is changing, is being changed. So we're just about on the brink of the crucial story where it becomes clear the Gentiles have a place at the heart of this story too. That's the fundamental transition of Acts, and obviously that's a story of exclusion and inclusion. But in a sense, that whole transformation is performed in this story in just 9 verses, which is why I say you've got the whole gospel here.
Thank you. So we've got inclusion and belonging, we've got gender and influence, we've got poverty and wealth, we've got power and humility, and we've got 2 journeys going in different directions. Outsiders being drawn in and Peter being drawn out, which is kind of making me think a little bit about the model of drawing in and sending out, which is really common in monastic communities, particularly in the Celtic Christian tradition. But I'm not going to lead us too far down a rabbit hole on that. So starting with you, Paul, and then coming back to Sam, given all of those dynamics, and there's so much about justice and power there, isn't there? Where would you draw in things that are going on today in speaking about that reading?
I think the first thing to say is I think that was I had missed large chunks of that. I'd read a few commentaries and I just hadn't got there. I think one of the problems actually is in the NIV Bible, which is kind of it was just the translation I was given when I was a child, when I first became a Christian, and that's the one I tend to default to. Doesn't use the word saint. It uses believer, which is much less powerful. And actually, to use your clue analogy, it kind of hides your clue.
Yeah.
So I think it's I find that really, really helpful. But it's really hard not to see justice issues as about exclusion. So the ones closest to my heart and close to my work are around poverty. And we are seeing there is a lot going on in the poverty sphere at the moment. There's a review around child poverty going on. There are benefit cuts, which are going to affect lots of people happening. And I think one of the things that the church has focused on is, where is the voice of people who experience poverty in those decision-making processes? Is that voice at least in the room when those decisions are made? And again, you have an example of a room in which all of those voices are being heard and being welcomed and being valued and are being included. And so for me, the obvious place to go is with that is around how do we get people's voices listened to and people's voices heard, people who don't have power, who have been excluded.
Absolutely. And I think there's something remarkable there about the way in which people are drawn into the room and Peter goes out, and that sense of getting people with lived experience into the right rooms where decision makers are discussing these things, but also getting decision makers out there to hear voices that they're not hearing. Sam, how about you? Is there anything going on at the moment in the world that you'd particularly want to draw into your preaching on this passage?
Well, as I mentioned, a chapter on political preaching that I wrote, and I've got some comments there about, when it's appropriate to refer to things and where it's appropriate. We have a thing at St Martin's where I am the vicar called Theology Group, where we have a few dozen people gather about once a month at lunchtime on a Sunday to discuss an issue that's on somebody's mind. And the issue I'm about to talk about, I think, would probably be a better fit for Theology Group than it would be for a sermon. But I'm struck by the phrase common sense. Today, as we're recording this, Trump has described his first 100 days as a revolution for common sense, or of common sense. I can't remember which. That's the phrase he's chosen to use. And then a week or so ago, we got the ruling from the Supreme Court in the UK about gender and common sense. And a lot of people, I just find if you use the word common sense and you need to shout that word, then I think there's a sort of difference between form and content, shall we say, put it politely. And most of the important things in life aren't common sense, actually. And if common sense becomes something that is weaponized, then I think it's no longer common sense. So this isn't a story about common sense. This is about grace. And grace is nuanced and subtle, and listens to different stories and perspectives, and draws in people from different backgrounds, and has a place for everybody. And that's why I say I think that the trans questions may be better dealt with in a theology group type setting than in a preaching type setting. But since we're talking about it, we're talking about political preaching. I was the one who brought up the trans issue, but then I think those kinds of messages can be made even if you don't actually name the issue that's in your mind. And that can be quite an effective way of talking. I've certainly done that about Trump in the last few months. It's more powerful if you don't name the person you're thinking of, because there are other contexts that usually apply. But the kingdom of God, it seems to me, is a realm in which we grow in perception and don't make instant judgments based on what outside grace might be perceived more generally as common sense. It's a place where we have a degree of humility and don't make judgments that automatically exclude.
So I'm saying I find the term common sense, especially in political discourse, to be essentially an assertion that I am in the dominant group. Exactly. It's an assertion of power.
Yeah.
And I think in 2019 general election campaign, Jacob Rees-Mogg said on a show that it would be common sense to leave Grenfell Tower. Because he would have done it because it was common sense. Yet the fire brigade had told people to stay. Is it common sense to stay, or is it common sense to go? And what he was actually saying was, I have the power to say that I am in some way superior, and that, I think possibly on reflection, he drew back from that and said conciliatory things around it. So it isn't a comment about him, but it is a comment about how you can deploy common sense in a way that really oppresses. And what's happening here, whatever, there's a person who was dead and is now alive. If you're using the word common sense in that context, your common experience is rather different to mine, frankly.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's something here, isn't there, about micropolitics as well as macropolitics. Yesterday, I was on a train that someone had forgotten to come get me off of. And my common sense as someone using a wheelchair was that I needed to sit in the doors, because if I didn't sit blocking the doors that were going to bang against my chair a lot, so if I sat there, then I wouldn't be able to get off the train. So I needed to sit blocking the doors while I waited for someone to come and help me. And a comment was made about it not being very sensible to sit in that place. But in fact, it was what was necessary. And I wonder if there's an illustration in there of how sometimes people who are marginalized in various ways have to use a different type of sense that maybe is more about grace coming out of lived experience. I'm going to take us on to John, because I think we could actually talk about Acts for a lot longer than we have. So let's speak a little bit about John and that phrase that drew you both in. Do you want to start us off, Sam, on that?
Yes, well, it's repeated, and that's always an important thing. I think the first thing to say probably about this passage is I was taught by a New Testament professor who was a historical critic and was very skeptical about a passage like John, or a chapter like John chapter 10 being anything other than a collection of Jesus' sayings that vaguely related to sheep. And if you think of, I am the gate, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, there are a number of different phrases, and it's quite difficult to work out how they all relate to one another. And this is, in America, certainly the main line in America, this is known as Good Shepherd Sunday, because we always get Psalm 23, we always get a bit of John or something about the Good Shepherd, about from John 10. And so if you're, on the surface, if it's Good Shepherd Sunday, you're in danger, particularly if you're politically minded, to talk about shepherds, which is a pretty well trodden path. I'm not sure there's a lot more to be gained from it. And to say, maybe the current president of the United States isn't as good a shepherd as one or two other shepherds is, that comes under the uninteresting label for me. But what remains, as I said at the beginning, much more visceral, is the fact that you will never be lost. Nothing will ever be wasted. You will never ultimately be lost. And I always say that the most significant date in the 19th century for the Church in England was 1853, when F.D. Morris was fired as Professor of Theology at King's College London, just about half a mile from where I'm sitting, because he refused to subscribe to the doctrine of eternal hell. And once you've done that, he basically started a century of the Church starting to stop believe in eternal hell. And if you do start to stop believing in the doctrine of eternal hell, then you have to find another basic purpose for the Church. Because if the Church for many centuries has largely been about pushing people upstairs and preventing people from going downstairs, and then you stop believing that downstairs is as described in the most vivid and lurid passages in the New Testament and then embellished in the Middle Ages, and because the debate has usually taken place on moral grounds, a good God wouldn't want to be horrible to us. I think it's really a sovereignty issue. That's to say, a God who was capable of creating us cannot be incapable of refining us to a degree that we belong in God's company and one another's and the company of the renewed creation forever. That's, to me, wholly implausible in terms of sovereignty. And so that does change what we live for. We don't live for a vital moment when, seconds before our death, we say yes, please, to heaven and salvation and so on, and are delivered upstairs. That life isn't shrunk down. Elsewhere in this very chapter, Jesus says, "I came that they might have life and life abundant." The phrase I like to use is living God's future now. Our purpose in life is to live together today the life that we believe will be given to us forever with God. And what this is telling us is that we can't screw it up. And so that whole, for all the fact that we talked in the Acts passage about our propensity to exclusion of different social groups, even if we're one of those excluded groups, we still have the same propensity to exclude others. This is about self-exclusion, I think. We can't screw it up. We can't exclude ourselves. We can't reject. Our rejection will be embraced and enveloped in God's acceptance. So we can't somehow, like a cricket ball, wheedle our way out of God's cupped hands. And the last thing we should be doing is finding elaborate reasons to explain why other people don't belong in God's hands. That's a kind of externalization of our self-rejection, if you want to be all psychological about it. So, those are the kind of things that I'm thinking.
Do you want to come in there, Paul?
The note that I'd written by it was around fear, which I think resonates with what you'd said, Sam, that there's lots. One of the worst things I see from some of the systems that people are forced to go through, they create a fear, which means people can't take risks, which means that people are straightforwardly sitting only in survival mode, and they know that punishment or something bad will happen if they deviate only a little. And in that, no one will snatch them out of my hand. You have a very different environment. You have an environment which says, actually, you can make a mistake. You'll be okay. You can try, you can strive, that you will still be with me, and I will still be with you as I strive and move myself and try to get myself forward. And for me, there's a really interesting contrast between that way of being and the way of being which is utterly stuck and desperate to avoid punishment. I'm listening to Sam speak there. It reminds me of the very fundamentalist Ulster Protestant background that I come from, in which fear of going downstairs was basically 90% of what we were taught from an early age. And it's quite disempowering. The idea that God wants you to flourish was there, but actually you prioritized not failing over flourishing and doing. And again, I think there's something in that to talk to the congregation about.
Thank you both. That was a really powerful conversation. I'm going to bring us just really briefly to Revelations. Now, I usually avoid preaching from Revelation. I'm going to be honest. I think, Paul, you may have said something similar earlier in this conversation. I think there's a lot of unpacking that we often need to do when we speak about this. But I guess I wondered, and I could be reaching here, folks, so please tell me if there might be a way to bring in Christian Aid's comments and work around Guatemala in this, because what they're talking about really in Christian Aid Week this year is the plight of communities most affected by the climate crisis. And at the beginning of our reading from Revelation, we have this vision of a great multitude from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, coming before the Lamb, before God, and crying out, saying, "Salvation belongs to our God." And I guess I felt like there are two ways that you can see that cry, as a cry of praise, salvation belongs to God, or perhaps as a plea. And I started to wonder, well, what pleas might folks from Guatemala make in that moment? Now, is that too far of a reach to make a link for? Where might you go with the Revelation reading if you spoke about it?
I think this is if you're familiar with the chapter 19 or book 19 of Augustine's City of God, it's a book. It's a part of Augustine's work that became very fashionable about 35 years ago, particularly through John Milbank's work in theology and social theory and the radical orthodoxy movement. And the basic kernel of that, in a sentence, is that Augustine says, without true worship, there can be no true justice. And what he means by that is that he regards worship as his point often made, worship, giving justice is giving each their due, and worship is giving God God's due. And if you don't give God God's due, how can you give anyone else their due? That's basically, and that's why he says the Roman Empire was unjust and the church is just. So this is actually about justice, in a sense that worship is about justice. I do think that every nation is crucial to this passage. All tribes and peoples. Again, there's the repetition. So this is for everybody. I'm just a bit nervous about applying that first couple of sentences to Guatemala, because there's that danger of centering ourselves, that we say, well, we're obviously part of this in Guatemala. Oh, yes, don't leave them out. Do you see what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
that's always the problem with inclusion. As we center ourselves, we become the complacent, sorted and normal ones. And then there's these weird people, and we should be jolly nice to them and have them in too.
Yeah.
So that's what makes me nervous about structuring the exegesis in that way. I think it can be avoided, and I think Paul's comments about the Good Samaritan are absolutely spot on in that respect. This is a powerful, the second half of the passage. It's clearly there because of the line in the very last verse, verse 17, the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. It's another shepherd passage, Paul. That's kind of why it's there, I think, in the lectionary for Good Shepherd Sunday, as it were. But there's obviously a lot more to the passage. It's a wonderful description of heaven. But the crucial giveaway line, I suppose, to continue the thing we talk about saints in the Acts passage, is these are they who have come out of the great ordeal in verse 14. Revelation can only be understood as a book written by people under persecution, saying we will prevail. God will prevail. And it can be a bit bloodthirsty, and you have to forgive it quite a lot of what we fancy happening to our enemies who are being so horrible to us. It's not necessarily modeling forgiveness in the best possible way, should we say. But, we've all experienced those feelings of hatred towards people who are persecuting us in one way or another, or towards those who are persecuting other people. So you have to, but, Revelation is vivid, shall we say, to use a euphemism. This isn't one of those passages. This is a passage which, rather like the no one will snatch passage, is saying, justice and truth will ultimately prevail, and rather like the Acts passage is saying there is a place for everybody. So those would be the two lines, and I think those two simple lines, justice will prevail and there is a place for everybody, do apply to Guatemala. So I think you would have to sort of come at it from that direction. And to go against everything I said at the beginning, I think you probably could talk about all three passages in a Christian Aid sermon. How about that? You never thought you'd hear me say that.
Very good. And I guess in that context of eco-justice and thinking about our worship as something that our work for justice is a part of, is connected with, flows out of, we need to think about our actions as well, and not kind of do that othering that you were pointing to as a risk. Paul, anything to add before we start to pull things together?
Very briefly, it is that idea of every nation. That, what do we mean by that? Is in the current context where nationalism is becoming more endemic in the world, and is becoming more brutal in its outlook. There's a real question of what we mean by every nation and how we work that out. And I think you can bring in Guatemala and Christian Aid, because we obviously recognize that we are joined and part of that every nation. But the term nation is hugely politically potent at the moment. And I think an exploration of what we might mean by it, what we might want to say into that conversation is important. Maybe not here, but that feels the word that is the most politically potent now.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much, Sam, for coming and being our guest today in this conversation. I think this has been a really rich conversation, and I think, if anything, we've left people with so many ideas that they could preach on these passages for a long time. So that's brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. I hope this episode helps you in your preaching prep. If you enjoyed the episode, please do leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms, so do have a look. And that conversation about worship leading into or being connected with work for justice made me think about the fact that in the Iona community, when you're on Iona, you don't kind of sit back down or stay sitting if you already were and kind of hang out in Iona Abbey at the end of a worship service. You either stay standing, or if you're already sitting, prepare yourself to move, because we go straight into work from worship, and we see that as symbolizing the work for justice that our worship is a part of. So I'm going to close us with a sending out from the Iona Community worship book. In work and worship, God is with us. Gathered and scattered, God is with us. Now and always, God is with us. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you both.